In the name of God, in whom we live and move and have our being. Amen. Mama, tell me a story of when you were little. That's how my 7-year-old starts most meals, asking me to tell her a story. And not just any story, but one of my stories. And so I think about back to when I was a kid growing up in New Hampshire with my parents and my 2 brothers. And my daughter laughs, listens, asks questions. And I know in some mysterious way, she is making my stories part of her story. That's what we do as human beings. We tell each other stories. We tell each other stories so that we will remember, try and find the meaning of the living of our days. Always telling stories, wanting to remember where and whom we came from, who we are. Those are words by Craig Hella Johnson from the musical piece Remembering Matthew Shepard. It's a piece St. George's Choir was working on before the shutdown. But this piece and these words speak to that same human desire to tell stories, to share our stories. Because we all have stories of experiences we've had, stories of our families and of our ancestors, stories that help make us who we are, stories that form our identity and shape how we see the world, how we understand the world. Stories are our human way of making meaning. We make meaning of our lives by telling our own stories and those of others. And we make meaning of our faith by sharing the stories of how God has acted in the lives of the faithful, how God is acting now in our own lives. So, might take a moment to reflect on what the important stories are for you in your life and in your faith. What are the stories that you tell that help you know who you are and who God is? There are many stories of our faith that help us know who we are as followers of Jesus and how he's at work in our lives. And this morning we hear one such story about 2 of Jesus' disciples walking along a road out of Jerusalem where Jesus has just been crucified. They're on their way to a place called Emmaus, about 7 miles outside of the city. And as they walk, they talk about what has happened. They tell each other the story of Jesus' death. They go over all the details, what they know and what they don't know, what they don't understand, what they did and what they wished they had done, what they find heartbreaking. All of those details, they tell them over and over. They try to piece together what they know and what they think. They try to comprehend their grief at losing Jesus and their utter confusion about the reports they've heard of an empty tomb and a risen Jesus. In the midst of their storytelling and making meaning of these events, Jesus himself comes and walks with them. But they don't recognize him. To them, he's just a stranger. He's a stranger who doesn't know their stories. And so they tell this stranger about Jesus, a prophet mighty in word and deed before God and all the people. They tell him the terrible death of this Jesus whom they loved and followed. And they tell him, but we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Right? That's their story. They were followers of Jesus whom they hoped would change everything for themselves and for others. And now that hope had been lost. Now they have to let go of that story because that story ended with their friend and their teacher dead on a cross, his broken body laid in a tomb. Except we know that that's not the end of their story. They go on to tell this stranger of the women who were at the tomb early that morning, and they didn't find Jesus' body. And so they came back with the story of an angel and a message that Jesus was alive. Now, what could this part of the story possibly mean? Well, they don't know yet. They simply share with the stranger what they do know, and they retell it to him. The stranger who listens, the stranger they feel themselves drawn to, who stays with them when they ask him to, who sits at table with them. And then this, when he was at table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it and gave it to them. And then their eyes were opened. They recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. Then they realized it was Jesus who has been raised. They go back and tell the rest of Jesus' followers that they had seen him and that he'd been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. And that becomes part of their story, that Jesus is alive, that Jesus walked with them and stayed with them, and that Jesus was known to them in the breaking of the bread. And that's part of our story too, that Jesus is alive and present with us in our walk and in our lives. Jesus is at the table with us always. Jesus is the bread we break together, even when we can't be together. This is still our story. This is still the good news. Christ is risen indeed. And even at the grave, we make our song, Alleluia, Alleluia, Alleluia. He is with us in the breaking of the bread. He's with us in the joys of our lives. He's with us in the heartbreaks. He's present in this moment, even now. That's the story of our faith. That's the one we tell ourselves and we tell each other, the story we remember and try to hold on to. For know this, our current circumstances don't change this essential story of our faith, that Jesus is alive and that he is present with us, that God will always bring new life out of what has died and make whole that which has broken. That's our story. At the same time, our current circumstances do prompt a question. What story will we tell later about this time we are living through now? What story will we share about our community and ourselves? Will it be only a story of being behind locked doors and afraid? Will it be a story of some who have enough resources and reserve to get through and some who don't, and every person for themselves? Will it be a story of reaching out to each other with mutual care and support? Will it be a story of staying connected as a community, or a story of disintegration? Will it be a story of hope and new life, or a story of despair? We who are living this right now, see, we get to decide. We get to shape this story. We get to choose how to respond to what is happening. We can make this a story of how we cared for each other. We can make it a story of connection. We can make it a story of care and compassion by our choices and our actions. We can make it a story we want to tell our children and our grandchildren about how we came through this as a community. And we can tell them about how the stories of our faith got us through, especially the story of Jesus who's present with us and walking with us on this road, who stays with us and breaks bread with us, who calls us to new and risen life, this day and always. Amen.